Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's presentation. My name is Ned Bowman and I am the Outreach Coordinator with Great Basin Bird Observatory. We are a nonprofit bird research organization based in Reno, Nevada. Tonight's presentation is part of our winter lecture series. You can find out about upcoming presentations on our website gbbo.org and by looking up Great Basin Bird Observatory on Facebook and Instagram. Tonight's presentation is by Lauren Whitenack, a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno. She will be talking about her research on mountain chickadees in the Sierra Nevada. Due to a technical difficulty, we are missing the first few minutes of her presentation on this recording, and we apologize for that.
So we have this crazy weather system that shows up in the winter, and it's called an atmospheric river. So when an atmospheric river forms, it's when tropical moisture over the Pacific Ocean evaporates and turns into clouds, and then those clouds eventually make their way to the California coast, cool down, and then it rains on the coastal range. And if it makes it to the Sierra Nevada, it dumps heavy snow and rain. And this happens usually a few times every winter. But this tropical moisture system coming off of the Pacific Ocean is what is really key to us getting so much snow here. Okay, so climate change is really gonna impact this snow-driven ecosystem that we live in. And climate change has already shown some increases in precipitation intensity, meaning we get years of extreme heavy snow and we get years of extreme drought. And it is predicted that these huge swings in snow depth from being very, very heavy snow to very, very light snow are going to increase in frequency with climate change. And so this makes it even more complicated for these animals that live in these habitats. Some other weird things that are a little bit counterintuitive to think about at first, but precipitation is actually projected to increase in the Sierra Nevada with climate change. And again, this is because the warmer ocean is there's going to be more water evaporating in the tropics, and those storms are going to be reaching us. However, because it will also be warmer here, we will have a huge reduction in snowpack. So they're expecting that a lot of the winter precipitation is going to be falling as rain instead of snow. And the snow line is going to increase in elevation. And when I say snow line, I mean that approximate line of elevation on the mountain, where below that line, most of the precipitation falls as rain, and above that line, most of it falls as snow. So a snow line in our area can vary, right? But it can be around 6,000 feet or so, around maybe 7,000. So this snow line is really important. And yeah, I think I covered everything I was going to talk about there. But yes, so the snow line is going to increase. So it's really counterintuitive. There may be deeper snow at the very, very highest elevations, but overall across the Sierra Nevada, there is going to be a huge reduction in snowpack. And so that's going to be a huge concern for California and for droughts. Okay, how do animals deal with extreme winters? Does anybody want to throw something out there?
Hibernate?
Yes, hibernation. Anybody else?
Move.
Yes. Migration. We have migration and hibernation. Anything else? What about animals that stay here?
They store food.
Yay! Yeah. Okay, so we have animals. These are all animals that are at my field site. The hermit warbler migrates down to Mexico. Some of them may go to California, but they move. The marmots, they dig a hole in the ground and they hibernate. And Clark's nutcrackers are one of the species that collect and store food throughout the fall, and then they go and retrieve that food. And animals dealing with winter, the hardest part about dealing with winter is the lack of food. For most of these animals, it is not the cold, it is the lack of food. That is, except for maybe some animals like insects. So insects do this thing during winter that is similar to hibernation. It's called dormancy. And so a lot of insects will spend the winter underground as larvae or as eggs, sometimes as adults. And so this is just an image sort of a beetle's life cycle. Many of the beetles in our area do this, where they lay their eggs in the ground and the larvae spend the winter underground. And then they emerge as adults in the summer. This is important because winter conditions can affect the overwinter survival of these insects underground. And the insects make up the main food base for a ton of the animals that we have in our habitats. So for example, there's this really cool study out of New Hampshire that showed that the more snow that was insulating the ground in the winter, there was actually higher survival of overwintering insects that were underground. And this is because snow insulates the soil from freezing. And so these insects that were underground weren't freezing. And so that's just an example of how winter conditions really influence the ecosystem throughout the year, right? Okay, the snow-driven ecosystems, summers are really hard too. And this is because for many animals, the breeding season starts late and ends early. It starts late because there's snow until July sometimes, right? And it ends early because a lot of these animals need to start preparing for winter. So there is this pressure to breed early to have time to molt or store food or develop or otherwise prepare for winter, because winter is often the harshest time of year for a lot of these animals. Additionally, food availability in the summer can be affected by winter conditions, and that's one of the examples is the overwintering insects underground, but also plant life, right? So if we don't get enough snow in the winter, then we end up in a drought in the midsummer, and then the growing season is much shorter for plants, and that affects the whole ecosystem going up. Okay, so this is the best slide in the presentation. This is my study species, Mountain Chickadees. They're a small non-migratory songbird that resides in the Western United States, in all of the mountain ranges and up into Canada. So they're in the Rockies, they're in the Sierras, and they're in the Cascades. They are a conifer specialist, meaning that they are only really found in conifer forest. And they are cavity nesters, but they don't build their own cavities. So unlike Carolina chickadees, which do excavate their own cavities, this was one of the questions. Hopefully you already answered the trivia stuff. But mountain chickadees are secondary cavity nesters, meaning that they use holes that have been excavated by other animals. So in our study system, it's usually probably Williamson's sapsuckers, white-headed woodpeckers, hairy woodpeckers, that kind of thing. So luckily, they readily use these lovely nest boxes that we built for them. Chickadees are also a bird that is a food caching species. So like Clark's nutcrackers, chickadees can afford to stay over the winter in these harsh snowy environments by creating a pantry for themselves and then going back and finding all these seeds. They're scatter hoarders, which means that they hide each seed in a different location. And so they have a really incredible spatial memory. They can remember where all of these different tens of thousands of locations are. Okay, but in the summer, they do what this lovely individual is doing, and they eat tons and tons of insects. Insects and spiders are going to be their main diet. And in general, these birds are known to be generalists, meaning that they don't rely specifically on any groups, but that's kind of an unknown area, subject area in terms of these guys. We just think they're generalists. Okay, so my field site is located at Sage Hen Experimental Forest. I don't know if you guys know where that is. It's about 8 to 10 miles north of Truckee on 89. And at this site, we study our birds at two distinct elevations. We have a high elevation site, which is above the snow line. It's really, really high elevation. It's 8,400-ish feet is the highest point. And then we have a low elevation site, and this is kind of below the snow line. This is about 6,500 feet. And these two elevations are really different from each other in terms of climate and also vegetation communities. They look super different, but they're only about 7 miles apart from each other. They're very close to each other. Okay, so what we do in our system, and we've been collecting these data for 11 years now, is we have about 400 nest boxes set up at these 2 different elevations, about 200 per elevation. And we track the breeding biology of the birds that use these boxes every year. So we start visiting these boxes and checking on them in April when nest building is occurring. So this is a picture I took of a chickadee that I just happened to flip the box open, and the chickadee was actively building, working on the nest. So we track them from nest building to egg laying to when the babies hatch. And then when the babies are 16 days old, they're the cutest they'll ever be. But this is also when we collect all of our data on them. So we weigh them, we put a silver band on them so that we can track the individuals. And we count how many of them survived. So this ends up allowing us to have all these detailed data on each nest where we can understand the timing of when these birds decided to breed, the clutch size, how many eggs the female laid, how many birds ended up surviving to day 16, and then their masses. Okay, so why is it important to study patterns of reproduction? Why do we do this? When we look at these broad scale patterns, we can start to understand if our population is changing. So if we start seeing that our birds are having smaller and smaller brood sizes, for example, that's a really bad sign, right? And so just tracking how the population is changing is really interesting. We can also understand how the population responds to different conditions. So heavy snow year versus drought year, right? Really, really hot spring versus cold spring, these types of things. Low food abundance, high food abundance, right? And we can also do really cool things like estimate fitness and measure natural selection. So if we can understand how many babies a female has raised throughout her whole lifetime, and then that's a measure of fitness that we can then use to see if there are certain characteristics about her that led her to have that many babies, etc. So over the 11 years that we've studied these birds, we have documented a lot of variation in these different breeding metrics that we collect, including first egg date. So if you could see on the left-hand side, we have our low elevation data, and on the right-hand side, we have our high elevation data. And if you notice right away, our low elevation birds are usually breeding at the same time. Does everyone see that? They're usually breeding around the same time. Our high elevation birds are usually breeding later than our low elevation birds, and there's more variation. So if you see 2017, they bred much later than the rest of those years. 2019 was another year they bred late. Does anyone have any idea why they would be breeding late?
Snow.
Snow. Yes, snow. So they're breeding later than low elevation overall, but they're also breeding much later in heavy snow years. We also see variation in mean nestling mass. And nestling mass is an indicator of nestling fitness, and it can be indicative of whether that nestling may survive the fledging period and be recruited into the population later. So heavier nestlings are usually considered better quality and more likely to survive because they've been fed more in the nest, and they have better nutrition, and so they have more fat stores, and are more capable of surviving those really harsh fledging conditions. So years when there's really low mean nestling masses could be concerning, right? So starting to understand why there is variation in these fitness indicators can be really important. So my overarching kind of theme for my dissertation is what causes this variation? What causes this variation in reproductive success, in reproductive timing? And in order to answer this, we use this really, really cool tool that we have, these weather stations that are located at our site. So we have these snow-tell stations that are just sort of small weather stations that measure precipitation, temperature, soil moisture, and temperature on an hourly basis. We have these at both our high and low elevation sites. So we can really get a localized idea of what's happening across elevations. And it can give us really cool data like these. This is mean average daily temperature across the year, and then each year is in a different color or line type. So you can see that temperature gets really low in the winter, right? And gets higher in the summer, that makes sense. But each year is slightly different, right? This graph is perhaps more interesting because it's snow. So snow is really, really different between these two elevations. So this is monthly snow across the x-axis. And you can see that our high elevation site, there are 3 years where we got above 350 centimeters of snow at the peak. And so my first question that I answered in for my dissertation was, how is climatic variation associated with differences in reproductive timing and success of these birds? How do these differences in weather across years affect our birds? And the inspiration from this came from this famous system of great tits. So this is the European equivalent of a chickadee. Great tits are very close relatives to chickadees. They're in the same family. And they have similar ecology, and that a lot of them are caching species. They're insect eaters, etc. But great tits, in this system that has been studied for a long time, they live in a very mild climate. So they live in Oxford in the UK, and researchers there have been studying them for about 70 years. So it's a really, really awesome data set. And they've found that birds are shifting their breeding timing to be earlier due to warmer springs. So this graph shows the warmth sum of spring temperatures. So they basically added the average temperature each day for like a period in the spring, and that's the warmth sum, right? And the laying date is on the y-axis. So the laying date is earlier when the temperature in the spring is warmer. And they actually found that this was directly related to caterpillar abundance. So caterpillars are also advancing their timing. Caterpillars are emerging earlier because of warmer springs. And insects are highly, highly dependent on temperature for coming out of that dormant period that I was talking about. So once insects experience a certain temperature threshold, they resume development, and they come out and they start acting like adults, or not acting like adults. They come out as adults, or they come out and they continue development into an adult. And so temperature is really important for insects. But I did not find the same relationship with our birds. So I actually did not find that spring temperature was associated with breeding timing. Our birds are actually not shifting their breeding timing with spring temperature. And this might be because the strongest warming trends in our area are actually in the late summer, and they're not in the spring. This might also be because we only have 11 years of data. I don't know, they have, I think, 40 years of their climate data. So we did not find this. Instead, we found, as you would expect, high elevation birds delayed their breeding in heavy snow years. And this was the most important control on breeding timing in this system. We also found that brood size was smaller when there was less snow, at low elevation only. So if you remember me talking before about how our high elevation places in the Sierra Nevada, our high elevation sites supply water to the lower elevation sites year round, right? So when we have less snow, then our low elevation sites and into the valley become water stressed because there's not as much snow. And so this could mean that there is lower food availability that year, and that could mean why there were lower brood sizes that year. Okay, but we don't really actually know this because we don't have insect data yet. And many birds rely on insects as their primary food source during the breeding season. And in many habitats, temperate habitats, insects experience a peak in abundance within a year. So usually in the spring or summer, that's when the most insects are out and available for the birds. And so theoretically, there should be this optimal breeding timing window where birds should try to time their breeding so that they can have plenty of bugs out in the environment to feed their nestlings, right? And we know that birds use cues from their environment. They use cues like rainfall, temperature, and then the classic photo period, so how many daylight hours they're experiencing, to trigger these, to trigger breeding timing, right? So their hormones change when they experience these conditions, and then they start getting into breeding condition and building nests and whatnot. But with climate change, these cues that they're using are changing. So we see warming temperatures and precipitation extremes that historically throughout their evolution, these species have not experienced. And there is this worry that climate change may lead to different phenological responses across taxa. So what this means is that plants and insects may shift their timing differently with changes in temperature. They may react differently to higher temperatures than vertebrates, like birds. And when this happens, this can lead to phenological mismatch, meaning that the timing of insects and birds is no longer synchronized. So birds are no longer able to synchronize their breeding timing in order to achieve that high abundance of insects in their environment that they need to feed their nestlings. But most of the studies on the trophic level mismatch that they're concerned about have been conducted at low elevations, for example, like the Oxford system, in deciduous forest, where caterpillars are the most abundant insects and usually are the dominant food source for many of these birds, and much less is known about what's happening in coniferous forest at high elevation. So I wanted to ask the questions, do chickadees match the peak arthropod food abundance in their environment? And does it matter? Does it matter for their fitness? So do they raise more babies when they do match the peak, for example? And in order to do this, I have to find insects. I have to get insect data. And so this is the strange cartoon that I found of somebody holding an umbrella underneath a tree. But really what this person is doing is they're conducting beat sampling. So this is me out in the woods with a beat sheet, and I just hit conifer trees. I hit 30 conifer trees at each elevation about once every 2 days for the whole summer. And I collect a crazy number of insects. So I use beat sheet sampling because it collects bugs on trees. And our chickadees are primarily consuming bugs that they are gleaning off of conifers. Beat sheets collect things like larvae, so like caterpillars and sawfly larvae. They collect beetles that are on trees, spiders, and true bugs, things like aphids. But they're really bad at collecting flying insects. And you can imagine this would happen because when you hit the tree, all the flying insects, they can just fly away. Or they'll see your shadow and then they'll fly away. And so I use malaise traps as a supplemental way to understand how these other, the trends in these other taxa. So malaise traps are really good at collecting flies, Hymenoptera like wasps and bees, flying beetles, and adult Lepidoptera moths. So I use malaise traps as well. And this looks beautiful and whatever, but what this really ended up being was, especially this past year, which was a crazy snow year, is me hiking all over the place in the snow, sifting through snow on a beat sheet to find whatever spiders and things were in there, hanging a beat sheet in the snow. We hang these beat sheets, sorry, not beat sheets, we hang these malaise traps because there are a lot of bears at our field site, and the bears just mess with everything. Like, we've learned this over time, they will destroy anything that they can grab. And so over time, we've had to adapt our bird feeders that we put out, for example, so that they're not on poles, because the bears can pull the poles over, but so that they're hung up and out of reach of the bears. So I hang these malaise traps, but when the snow depth is 15 feet, it's hard to hang it really any higher. And so this is me in the middle, taking a sewing needle to a malaise trap that has been ripped down by a bear. And then I just spent a lot of time hiking in the snow and slipping in the snow to find these insects. Okay. So I'm gathering all these insect data, but I don't actually know if I'm gathering relevant information to what our birds are eating. So I need to understand what our nestlings are eating so that I can then make sure that I'm collecting the right data. So we use this really cool new technology called eDNA, environmental DNA, metabarcoding, where you can collect a sample from the environment, water sample, a poop sample. You can extract the DNA and amplify the DNA, sequence it, and then you can match those sequences to existing sequences of animals and plants out there that have their DNA sequenced already. And a ton of species of plants, animals, insects have their DNA sequenced now, at least in these small regions that we amplify. So we can get really accurate down to species level, but usually down to family or genus, understanding of what our birds are eating. It's really cool. Okay, so I started all this work in 2022. So to orient you, this is snow depth on April 1 across all the years that we have available for our study site. 2022 was a relatively low to moderate snow year. As you can see, it's circled down there on the right. And so that'll be important later. But from the fecal metabarcoding data, we found that our birds are eating 25 orders of arthropods, so insects and spiders, from 150 families. So they have a really, really diverse diet, which was actually really surprising because a lot of other studies on birds show that their birds do not actually have a super diverse diet. A lot of them are relying solely on caterpillars or almost solely on caterpillars, right? So our birds are eating everything from spiders to tiny flies, tiny wasps, sawfly larvae, all these different things. And all of these photos are pictures that I took in the field or through the microscope after I took things back from the field. So these are all things that I found in the environment, and also we found in the DNA of our nestling feces. Does anybody want to guess what the most common diet item was? Just any group of insects, yeah.
Beetle.
A beetle?
Yeah.
It was not a caterpillar. I was expecting you to say caterpillar. It was a beetle. How did you know? So our most common diet item was this crazy beetle that there's hardly any information out there about this beetle. It's a type of scarab beetle. Most scarab beetles are, or a lot of scarab beetles, the most famous ones are dung beetles. So you guys know dung beetles are beetles that are decomposers. They recycle fecal matter, decomposing matter on the ground. They're nocturnal. They do not hang out on trees. So, you know, but then when I dug into more of this beetle's ecology, natural history, this is a conifer eating beetle. So this is a very unique natural history for a scarab beetle to be hanging out on a conifer tree and consuming the pine needles. But that's what these guys do. They spend their winter underground, and then they spend their adult life in trees consuming plant matter. And so that's how our chickadees are getting to them, is they're gleaning them off of conifers. Okay, so what did our overall insect trends look like in 2022 at low elevation? So this is beat sheet data. So on the top left, you can see I made this little beat sheet icon. So this will represent whenever I'm talking about data from beat sheets. At low elevation, you can see biomass started at nearly zero. There was very little insects out at that time. And the way that I'm calculating biomass is I'm just using these regression equations. So I'm estimating the lengths of each individual bug that I find. And then I'm plugging that into an equation that is specific for different families that can tell me what their mass was based on their length. So that's how I'm getting total biomass over here. But you can see that in early July was the peak. And the peak is really steep. And the peak doesn't last for very long, right? And so one would think that that is when they're trying to time their breeding, right? Is to match that peak. They're going to have so many things flying around to catch and give their babies. Okay, so our high elevation data, one might expect, since it's much higher elevation, it's different habitat, it's harsher climate, that the phenology or the timing of this peak might be later. Nope, it was not. It was actually at the exact same time, which was crazy. These peaks were actually composed of very different types of insects though. So our low elevation site had more caterpillars, our high elevation site had more beetles. And so that could be a reason why. Looking at our malaise trap data, we got the same exact peak dates from our malaise trap data, which was actually insane, I thought, just because they're collecting very different things. Malaise traps are passive collecting traps, so I'm not getting very as big of sample sizes with my malaise traps as I am with my beat sheet sampling. I'm getting like 30,000 insects a year or something with my beat sheets. But so that was really cool to see. So when are our birds nesting? One might think that our birds would nest right at the peak, but this was actually not the case. So this is our low elevation site, and each of these black bars represents a nesting period. So from the hatch day all the way to day 22 when the birds are leaving the nest. And that was another trivia question. The birds stay in the nest for 22 to 24 days, which is really long for songbirds. But it's very strange that they're breeding earlier than the peak food abundance, right? That is, just leads to more questions, really. Our high elevation birds, we could see also bred earlier. They might be overlapping a little bit more towards the end of those nestling periods, but they are still breeding before the peak in food abundance. And so remember, this was 2022. So do chickadees match the peak arthropod food abundance? No, I did not find that they match the peak. They're a little bit earlier than the peak. High elevation may overlap with the beginning of the peak, sort of at their end, but not what I was expecting. Okay, so when I was talking before about phenological matching and mismatching, is sometimes referred to as synchrony. So synchrony meaning when two different trophic levels, so like birds and insects that rely on each other, match in time, right? Their abundance, their peak abundances match, their timing matches. And so the way that I calculated synchrony was I took the hatch date and added 11 days. This puts us right in the middle of the nestling development period. So this puts us at day 12 in the nest. And other studies have shown that birds at this stage, they are requiring the most food. They're growing the fastest. They need a lot of calories to go through development at that time. And then I just took the difference between that date and the peak biomass date. So I said, how much time difference is between when our birds are relying on getting a lot of food and when most of the food is available in the environment? And I based this off of, again, this is the great tit system. This is a great tit feeding her little babies. And they have found that birds that had better synchrony, so synchrony is on the x-axis, and a synchrony of 0 would mean perfect matching. So the birds are perfectly matching with the peak insect abundance. So the great tit system has found that birds raise the most chicks and the heaviest chicks when they perfectly match or have a synchrony of 0 with their food. And so what I expected was that birds that bred farther from the peak, birds that timed their nesting farther, would have lower reproductive success than birds that bred closer, and that this would translate into a negative quadratic relationship with synchrony. So around a synchrony of 0, brood size or mean nestling mass would be maximized. Long story short, I did not find this at all. I did not find any associations between synchrony and between synchrony and reproductive success in 2022. Okay, 2023 was honestly a disaster. It was crazy. There was so much snow to the point where on June 27th, 2023, there was still 4 feet of snow at our high elevation site. And it had turned into what I learned as a term, these sun cups. These sun cups are when the snow melts really unevenly and it becomes nearly impossible to walk on because it's these craters. So this is a really challenging time for insect sampling when I started in April and went all the way to October. But our low elevation site was like normal, like summer, right? So, I'll just show you the insect data from 2023. So in 2023, the 2023 data is in a solid line, and the 2022 data is a dashed line, just for background. Because 2022 for us kind of represents a low to moderate snow year. So as you can see, our low elevation site had the same exact peak as last year. So the 2023 peak in arthropod biomass was the exact same date. But you can see that the peak kind of dragged out longer. So there's sort of a second peak there where there's more biomass for a longer period of time, much longer period of time. And I can only hypothesize that this is due to the growing season being longer because there was more water available later into the summer. At high elevation, they were super struggling. So overall, biomass was extremely low. The peak was at about half the amount of total biomass that I found in the previous year. The peak was also much later at high elevation. So, interesting stuff. I also found that the beetles were nearly absent at high elevation during this heavy snow year. So our low elevation data looks super similar. Honestly, the total beetle biomass peak was the exact same. But at our high elevation site in 2022, beetles made up most of the peak of insect biomass. So that dashed line, that huge spike, that was beetles in 2022. And most of those beetles were these scarab beetles. In 2023, the scarab beetles were nearly absent. Most of these most of the biomass coming from beetles was not scarab beetles, and it was much lower. So I only found 2 scarab beetles at high elevation the entire season in 2023. And so what are these birds eating? Because their main food source at high elevation completely vanished in 2023. Just to show you where they were overlapping with the insect biomass, at low elevation, again, they're breeding earlier than the peak. At low elevation, they bred at the exact same time as last year. At high elevation, they bred at really low biomass. Again, I did not find a relationship between synchrony and reproductive success in 2023. So this was, again, super unexpected, especially since insect abundance was so much lower at high elevation. You might think that timing may be more important when overall insect abundance is much lower, but I didn't find anything. So this is the brood sizes across all years of data that we have. If you look at our high elevation, brood size was the lowest or the second lowest that it ever was in all of our 11 years of sampling in 2023. And so if I were to guess, I would assume maybe that there was really low food abundance in 2023, and that's why these brood sizes overall were lower. They were not able to raise as many chicks, right? But we need a ton more data, and this is only 2 years of insect data, so I need about 30 more, or I can figure out something. Okay. So the question, do chickadees match the peak arthropod food abundance? No, they don't. Does it matter? I don't know. It doesn't look like it mattered in these 2 years, whether they match the peak. There may be some threshold of biomass above which the birds can do really well and below which they can't. So maybe they're just trying to time to a certain proportion of the biomass. And so hopefully in the next 10 to 20 years, I'll be able to figure out what that threshold is. Yeah.
So do you think maybe the chicks mature, they start feeding themselves, having the biomass be greater at the time the chicks leave the nest?
Yeah.
Is it an advantage for the chicks, maybe?
So the question was, do I think that birds are timing their breeding such that when babies leave the nest, they can be experiencing the highest food abundance? Basically, the fledging period, right? During the fledging period, maybe they're matching so that the birds can match that. That's a really good hypothesis. That's one of our current working hypotheses, right? Because maybe parents are really, really good at foraging. You know who's bad at foraging? Babies that have been fed for the last 22 days. They have no idea how to feed themselves. And so maybe, matching peak food abundance with the fledging period is more important than matching with the nestling food demand period. Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, but overall, it seems that our birds are trying to breed really early. They're breeding before the peak. Why are they doing that? Is breeding early advantageous for some reason? Maybe foraging during the breeding season, maybe that's not the hardest thing that these birds have to do all year. Maybe there's a harder thing that they need to do and they need to prepare for that. I'm really hinting at this, but winter, right? So why are birds pushed to breed earlier? I mentioned earlier in this presentation that a lot of animals are pushed to breed earlier because they need to prepare for winter. So these birds need to molt, they need to join winter flocks, they need to deal with the social hierarchy and dominance hierarchy that's going on in those flocks, they need to figure out how to cache, they need to figure out where all the food is. They have a lot to do before winter. And so I did a little supplementary analysis to try to figure out if I could answer this question in our system. In other systems that look at birds, that have studied birds in really high elevations or really high latitudes, like in Norway and Sweden, the blue tits and willow tits up there, they found that birds that breed earlier are more likely to be dominant, or sorry, not birds that breed earlier, babies that come from earlier nests are more likely to be socially dominant in their winter flocks and are more likely to recruit into the breeding population. This would translate into higher fitness for their parents, because that would mean that their parents' genetics, their genes, are being passed on to the next generation. Does that make sense to everybody? So if the birds survive the nestling period, that doesn't do anything for the parents' fitness. If the birds survive and then are able to breed in the next season, then their parents' fitness is increased. And so we have this really, really cool system because we know who all of our nestlings are. If we banded them in the nest, they have a silver band on, they have a unique numeric code. And if we recapture them, so we do a lot of winter work where we study their behavior, and then we recapture the adults in the breeding season so that we can know who they are. So we have a high chance, if the bird is in the area, of recapturing these birds. So all the nestlings from these nest boxes are banded and we can recognize them. But we band these guys and we put them back in the nest at day 16 and we say, good luck. And then all of these death experiences happen to them. So we start with all of these nestlings. We band, I want to say 500 nestlings at each, no, probably 500 nestlings per year, including both elevations. And after the nestling period, they hop out of the nest and they go through the fledging period where probably 90% of them die. Fledging period is an extreme mortality event for babies. They can't fly very well. They're very susceptible to predation. They don't know how to feed themselves. Then they go through the process of joining a winter flock and surviving winter. And we found in our system that juvenile mortality is the highest their first winter, or bird mortality is the highest during their first winter. So many of these birds are not making it out of their first winter. What we're left with after this are the recruits. The recruits are the birds that survived the fledging period in the winter. They survived all these death experiences, and they've made it into the breeding population, right? So since we have data from the recruits and we have data from the rest of their cohort that didn't make it, we can compare the timing of when did these birds come out of the nest versus when did these birds come out of the nest. And then we can see if there's something special about these recruits that makes them more likely to survive. And so I can ask, is there a fitness advantage to breeding earlier? And are nestling recruits more likely to be from early nests? And long story short, I did find this, but at high elevation only. So nestlings from early nests are more likely to recruit at high elevation compared to the rest of their cohort by a significant amount. So this is a complicated statistics graphs, but on the right-hand side, this is our high elevation site. And that red line is the mean timing of the recruits. And the timing was calculated based on the earliest first egg date in that year. So each year, the earliest nest is a 0. And all the other nests after that are given 1, 2, depending on how many days after that earliest nest they started. So basically we have earliest birds are the ones that are being recruited at high elevation. So I did find that there is a fitness advantage to breeding earlier. At high elevation, nestling recruits are more likely to be from early nests. So maybe they're breeding before the peak in insects for various reasons. Maybe it's because they're trying to time it so that their babies can experience the most food out of the nest as fledglings. Maybe it's, well, we know that it's because earlier nestlings are more likely to survive and recruit into the breeding population. Okay, so this is just a quick summary. I found so far that heavy snow is challenging for high elevation birds. It restricts their breeding season. They have to breed much later, and then they still have to prepare for winter in time, right? While drought conditions are challenging for low elevation birds. They have lower brood sizes, their growing season is shorter, they end up in a drought in the middle of the summer, and they probably have less food. I also found that there is a distinct peak in arthropod abundance each year, but chickadees are not matching this peak in food abundance, which is different from what other systems have shown, like the Great Tit system. I found that beetles may be more important than caterpillars for chickadee food in the high mountains. And one of the reasons for this could be that, like I said before, in deciduous forests, caterpillars are much more abundant than in coniferous forests. And so our birds, being generalists, may just be forced to rely on something else. I also found that breeding timing is complex at high elevations, and birds that breed earliest may have the best luck at surviving and making it to be a breeder in the population. Okay, so that is all I have for you. I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for coming out, and this is my lab, and I wouldn't be able to have any of this data without them. And my advisor in the middle with his giant camera. So I'll take any questions you guys have.
When the beetles were absent that year, what were the chickadees eating in the high elevation chickadee?
Yeah, this is like
They had to be eating something.
Yeah, so we just shipped those samples off in September or October, and we're waiting for the results.
Hey, Lawrence, sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, yeah.
People?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so the question was, what were the nestlings eating in 2023 if there were no beetles? If that was their main diet item in 2022. And we collected a bunch of feces from the nestlings in 2023, but we shipped them off to the lab of ornithology at Cornell, and we're waiting for the results. Yeah. Any other questions? Complaints? Yeah.
So do the chickadees tend to home or nest in the same place every year, or like where their parents nest?
Yeah, so the question was, do the chickadees tend to nest in the same places that they did in the previous years, or do they tend to nest where they were raised, basically? And the answer is yes. So these chickadees are insanely non-mobile. They are highly resident to their birth sites. So low elevation birds, if they're born at low elevation, they are gonna spend the rest of their life at low elevation. At high elevation, same. So we've only seen like 2 birds ever cross over from one elevation to the other, and it's usually from low to high, which is, I don't know, maybe I have no idea why that is, because it's harsher at high elevation. Yeah, and that's insane because these populations are so close to each other, but we never see them moving really. So they're very, very faithful to their birth site locations. Yeah.
Is it also like to like the nesting box, or is it just general elevation habitat type that they're?
So the question was, do birds tend to use the same nest boxes? The answer is yes. So a lot of times we will see the same male or female, use the same nest box year after year. We will also see them use like adjacent nest boxes, like nest boxes that are close by. There are also probably a lot of natural cavities out there. So if we don't see a breeding pair for a year, they might be nesting in a natural cavity that a woodpecker has excavated or something, for example. But yeah, they do tend to stay in the same places. Yeah.
Would you expect similar phenological results for other species in the same region?
Like other bird species? Sorry, the question was, would I expect the same phenological responses from other animals at my field site?
Yeah, like birds specifically.
The bird specifically. Okay, so in response to snow, so first of all, birds that are migratory are going to be showing up and starting to breed. They're going to be starting the breeding process much later than birds that are there over the winter. So usually birds that are like resident and are on site all year and don't have to migrate, they are usually able to start building their nests and that kind of stuff much earlier than migratory birds would. So like hermit warblers, first of all, hermit warblers are much more common at our low elevation site than our high elevation site. So I don't know if they're just avoiding the really snowy areas or what's happening with that, but they're likely to show up when conditions are much better, when it's later in the season, if that makes sense. But yeah, but insects, I think, are likely to all experience some kind of hardship from extremely long winters or extremely mild winters because there's no insulating snow to protect them underground. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah.
This is complicated. It seems like what you're saying is that the birds, the birds that fledge the soonest have the best chance of going into the breeding population. So could you also just theorize that because then they also have the longest period to learn the ropes, so to speak, of how to catch food, how to watch other birds acting out, as opposed to the ones that are later who don't have the same amount of time. Is that also a corollary to what you're seeing?
Yeah, so the question was, do I think that birds from early nests are more likely to survive and recruit into the population because they have more time to like learn the ropes of life because they have fledged earlier? Is that kind of
that's essentially.
Yeah, so like what is the mechanism for birds that are coming from early nests being more likely to survive? What is the mechanism for that? Yeah, I don't know. It's possible. It could be that they're learning. It could also be that they're just developing faster and getting better at foraging and these things faster because everybody else is in an earlier stage of development, which I guess is sort of what you were saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that could be a reason why, because then they could be more likely to be dominant in their winter flocks, which means that they have a better likelihood of surviving the winter because they have better access to food, etc. And that could all be because they came out of the nest earlier and were able to figure out life earlier. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good. I don't know how you would test that, but yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
So when you are monitoring the chickadees, it seems like it's you get to be pretty invasive, like monitoring, like you can open up the box and check on them like a couple different times, or is it cameras?
No, it's not. Okay, sorry. The question was, when we monitor the chickadees in nest boxes, is it invasive to them? Like how often are we visiting the boxes and that kind of thing? Was that your question?
Yes, I was asking like if you mostly use cameras or if the chickadees are just very like relaxed and chill about like people coming by. They're like, yeah, not happy about it, but it's fine. I'm not going to abandon. Yeah.
So the question is, do we use cameras in our nest boxes or do the chickadees just not care that we're disturbing them? Okay, yeah, this is a really good question. And any level of disturbance to birds is going to have a little bit of an impact, right? And so we try to visit the nest boxes as little as we need to. We visit them every every couple days when we're looking for hatching, and then once they hatch, we wait a while. We check on them once in a while. But the females never abandon. We've had no cases that we know of birds abandoning nests just because we have peeked into the box. They're very, very dedicated parents. We've seen crazy things like a male chickadee dive bombing a chipmunk and like hitting the chipmunk when it was getting close to its nest and things like that. And so we try to be very quiet and respectful when we're visiting the nests, and we don't see any large impacts from that.
Hey, Lauren, I don't know if you can see the chat on the screen there, but we have a question from Zoom. I can read it for you if you can't see.
Okay.
From Sydney Matkins.
Oh, I see it.
Oh, you
I
do?
see it.
Okay, great.
Yeah, yeah.
Just read that for us, please.
Yeah, okay, so we have a question from Sydney Matkins that says, if a nest gets predated and the parents renest, how is that accounted for? Oh, this is a good question. Okay, she says, I guess my first question would be, was nest predation high? So no, and in our system, nest predation is relatively low. In some systems, they lose like 75% of their nests that they're monitoring, especially ground nesting birds, because they're just really, really vulnerable. Cavity nesting birds are pretty protected. There is one species that we think, there might be more, but there's at least one species of chipmunk at our field site that is the main nest predator. They can just barely fit into the hole in the nest boxes. It's like it's like the smallest chipmunk. And they will eat the babies and stuff. We don't think that they're like specifically targeting chickadee nests and eating those eggs. We think it's just kind of like an opportunistic thing where chipmunks just run into a bird nest and they'll just eat a couple of the eggs. But that is the main nest predator. I think the only nest predator that we've ever had at our site. So chipmunks are no longer the cute little rodents probably in your heads, but so nest predation was actually pretty low usually. This past year, since it was a really, really heavy snow year, we actually had more nest predation at high elevation than normal from chipmunks. And we don't know why that is. We think it could be the chipmunks were starving. It could be because they were so snowy. It could be that the chipmunks are also secondary cavity nesters. And so maybe they were looking for a nest hole and they just happened upon chickadee nests. I don't know, but again, we still had a decent amount of nests this year. We had about 30 nests at high elevation, which is still pretty normal, that weren't predated. Okay, and then she asked if a nest gets predated and parents renest, how is that accounted for in the timing of nesting? So she's talking about second nesting or renesting attempts. So if a bird lays a nest and the whole clutch of eggs gets eaten, do they renest? And then how do we account for that in our timing? Well, we actually eliminate, if we're looking at relative timing, if we're looking at breeding timing, we exclude all renests and all second nests from our analyses because those nests are not being timed based on environmental conditions. They're being timed based on what happened to their other nest, right? So we just take those out of the analysis. And then how are the chicks now affected in the timing of available food and insects? We very rarely ever see our birds having second broods. So most chickadees actually ever only have one brood. However, at our low elevation site, we have seen like a handful, like maybe 5 birds ever have second broods. So they've had one successful brood and then they nest again. This only happens at low elevation because at high elevation, the breeding season is so constricted that they just have no time for that. And it rarely happens at low elevation. But we haven't quite decided what to do with those nests yet, like data analysis wise or like question wise, but it is an interesting idea. Are they like timed better to the insects? Because if the insects are much later than the first brood, then is the second brood potentially able to take advantage of peak insect abundance? And I don't think that in the last 2 years that I've been insect sampling, we have not had any second broods that I know of. But if we do have a year where we have a lot of second broods, it could be interesting to look at what they're eating and if it's different from the first nests. Yeah. Yeah.
You had mentioned that one of the things that triggered the birds to like their cycle when things were happening was rain and precipitation. Do you kind of know like the psychology of the birds, like how that kind of matches? Like, because I can imagine like daylight and temperature and food
Yeah.
triggering that, but I guess not as easily rain.
So rainfall, okay, so the question was, I talked about different environmental cues that animals use to time their breeding, photoperiod, temperature, and then I also mentioned precipitation. And can I elaborate on that? Like, why do they use that? Where do they use that? So precipitation is not a super common cue. Precipitation is really only used in animals that live in not temperate climates. So like climates that have like a rainy season and a dry season. The rainy season will be have more insect abundance. And so then, like, for example, in the dry Africa savanna, yeah, bye. And then maybe in like the Australian outback or something, there's a couple instances of using rainfall to trigger their breeding. Yeah.
How many more years are you gonna be trudging around in the sun cups?
I'm about to finish my 3rd year, and about to start my 3rd data collection season. And I'm thinking I'm gonna try to graduate in 6 years. So I have about halfway more to go, I guess. I'm about halfway done. Yeah.
I know you said you got started when you were 13, but like, did you go to school? What did you study? What are your major? What are you dividing?
Yeah, in undergrad, I was very confused, 18-year-old, and I thought I wanted to be pre-med because everybody told me that that's how I was gonna make money if I was good at science. Which is true, actually, but, so I started off as a biology major at a really, really big school. I went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and their biology program is very pre-med and microbiology focused. And then I very quickly figured out that that wasn't really my place and that I wanted to go back into studying the natural world. So I changed my major to environmental science, which is where the ecology program was kind of kept at that university, was in the smaller environmental science department. And so I did an ecology concentration. And I did some undergrad research during that time. So I got a research experience for undergraduates. It's a National Science Foundation program that funds students to go out for a summer and work at a university, or work with a PI and do some research. And so I got to study northern goshawk nest habitat preferences for a summer in undergrad, which was super fun. And then after that, UNC offered these really awesome field semester programs. So I got to go off campus and stay at a field site for a semester. And I worked on a rare warbler species there and doing sort of some spatial landscape ecology work on that as well. And then I did an honors thesis on that. That was so much information. Was that what you were asking for?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great. Interesting.
Is that it? Thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone.
Well, thank you to our Zoom audience for attending. I'm gonna sign out of our webinar. Sounds like when it comes to chickadees, the early chickadee does get the worm, huh?
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Zoom audience, for attending.